election process stands on three legs. Two necessary components are political parties and election authorities. But the third, they say, of this three-legged stool that keeps it from tipping over is the participation of civil society. And they made this very strong claim in 1998 that as they looked across the world and saw the third wave of democracy sweeping across various parts of the globe in the wake of the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, they saw the presence of these civic monitors as absolutely key to being able to run successful election processes in countries that might have been holding elections or credible elections for the first time ever or for the first time in a very long time. In the Americas, just to give you some context, this is not actually a tiny, tiny small-scale phenomenon. Between 1988 and 2008, 16 countries in the region have had what I call serious domestic election monitoring efforts, widespread, serious, nonpartisan efforts, in one or more elections. And you can see the countries where domestic election observers have been active. In some countries, there have been more than one national organization. Sometimes one organization is replaced by the other, and sometimes two are operating simultaneously. But 25 different organizations monitoring 58 major national election processes, whether those were presidential or general elections, legislative elections, or constitutional referenda, or referenda, nationwide referenda on any number of hot topics. Most of these groups also monitor elections at the state and or local level, depending on the election structure of the countries. It might also be interesting to mention that this is not a phenomenon that's isolated to the Americas. Many of these organizations, 21 of the 25 organizations that I note here, are part of a regional network called the Lima Accord that brings together domestic monitors from around the region to try to push their work forward. There are regional organizations in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in Europe, and there is now a new global network of domestic election monitoring organizations called GDEM. And it pulls together literally hundreds of organizations like Alianza Civica in greater or smaller part around the world. So with the rise of election politics in the world, we've also seen a rise of monitoring. But let's get to this case. What can the case of Alianza Civica tell us about? Now, I've told you that they've been active in elections since 1994. In between elections, they've also organized a variety of good governance, civic watchdog type activities, monitoring the behavior of elected officials, organizing informal citizen referenda, where literally they'll get their members out into the town squares over a weekend to ask for public opinion on major topics of national interest. Their most notable effort in that regard in 1995 was a referendum that they ran on the future of the Zapatista National Liberation Army. That was a sensitive topic because at that time the government was still making a decision about how hard to crack down on this insurgent group that had arisen in the south of Mexico in 1994. 1 million people came out and cast ballots in this referendum that was just going to be counted by this civic organization and publicized. It had no formal connection to the government. The Mexican Constitution doesn't provide a provision for direct forms of democracy such as citizen referenda on these types of issues. So this civic group went out and organized this. So they're not just working on elections or on election day. They're working in between elections on a variety of topics and issues. Another notable activity that they were involved in was a lawsuit against the presidency of the Republic, asking the presidency to disclose a whole category of funding that people knew was available to the President of Mexico, but the quantities, the uses, the rules for using it had never been disclosed before. And after long struggle, they weren't particularly successful in winning the lawsuit, but that funding was eventually disclosed, in a parallel but separate process. It wasn't forced open by the lawsuit per se, but it did open shortly after that whole snafu had been publicized. So those are some of the sort of sexier activities that Alianza Civica has been in Mexico besides the elections. So I have several hypotheses that I want to test, and these are what I would call best-case scenario hypotheses. These assume that if this is what we would assume, what we would want to know if they're doing, if we assume that domestic election monitors are really doing well. Alianza Civica is a good case to look at these types of hypotheses because it's got a long history, it's a credible case, it's one of the most well-regarded domestic monitoring organizations, both in the region and worldwide. And these hypotheses are derived from the literature on election monitoring, both international and domestic, as well as some of the literature on civil society and democracy. So the four that I want to examine are the following. Domestic monitoring organizations deter vote fraud. That by their presence, domestic election monitors can actually deter vote fraud. The second is that the presence of domestic monitors will increase the public's acceptance of the results. So knowing an election was monitored makes the public more likely to accept the results, whether or not they like the outcome. Third, that domestic monitoring organizations create human and social capital for electoral accountability. That is to say, they provide a means of training people, human capital, who are specialized in and understand the election process, and social capital in terms of bringing people together, creating ties that bind in society where there might not otherwise be those ties. And this is a bit of a two-part hypothesis, that domestic monitoring, in fact, creates these gains, and that those gains, in turn, contribute to improved election accountability. And then the last is the idea that domestic monitoring organizations, by their actions, model the possibility of nonpartisan support for the democratic process. This is a particularly important idea when you consider societies in democratic transition. Because competition may be relatively new, there isn't a long-standing tradition of supporting the process regardless of the outcome. So by having actors besides political parties who are in partisan contention, modeling an ideal of civic support for the process, it's thought that domestic monitors can contribute to the stability of electoral politics and the sustainability in that case. So the methods that I use in this research include participant observation with Alianza Civica since 1996. I've been working with studying the organization for a long time. I wrote my master's thesis about how such an organization could emerge in the Mexican political context. And I've maintained contact, and I go back frequently. As Dr. Edwards mentioned, I've been back many times to observe elections with Alianza Civica. I have also systematically been collecting data on the size and the scope of the monitoring work and the other work, the interim election work that Alianza has been doing since 1994. I've had a series of interviews with the organization's board members, as well as the grassroots volunteers who get out there and engage in these projects, and what I call key observers, so people who are key observers of the Mexican political situation but are not involved in Alianza Civica, to try to get a little balance in the information that I'm getting. I've done these interviews in a structured way now at 4 different points, in 1996, 2000, 2003, and 2009. And finally, I trace the processes, the political processes and the activities of Alianza Civica, and try to find patterns in these two. This is in the literature called process tracing. And I do that through the use of primary and secondary source documents, principally. Primary source documents would be the actual statements, press releases, web information, YouTube video posts, Twitter tweets of the organizations, and some of its members, particularly its key directors and board members, as well as secondary source documents such